Could you please give your name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Yes, my name is Katerina Ardrew. I'm the co-chair of the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organisations.
Thank you. We're very grateful for your time before the committee today. I invite you to make a short opening statement, after which the committee members will direct questions to you.
Great, thank you. I'm here on behalf of the Ukrainian community. We represent about 53,000 Ukrainians here in Australia across all the states and territories. Over the past year, we have been dealing with the aftermath of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine that has impacted our community greatly, both on a psychological level and on a physical level. We have many displaced Ukrainians here, about 5,000 that have arrived from Ukraine, which currently have been separated from their families, with husbands, sons, brothers on the front line. We not only deal with the trauma of war, but also the reason that I'm here today is Russian propaganda and what we see as foreign interference through social media, which is one of the most active channels that the Russian Federation currently activates, not only its employees through the consulate and the embassy, but has other agents within the community. And I would love to discuss that in more detail today and provide any answers and insight that I can from a Ukrainian community perspective.
Great, thank you very much. We have heard from some other diaspora community organisations, and the perspective of these community groups is very important to the committee, as we understand that they are often on the front lines as targets of attempted foreign interference and victims of transnational repression and coercion, and obviously particularly in recent times after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Ukrainian communities in Australia have been clearly targeted by Russian actors online. So we're very interested to hear about the experience of Ukrainian Australians. Could you give us some insight into particularly those Ukrainian Australians who've been vocal about the war and those who've been outspoken about it, what experiences they've had online and what that's meant for them?
We have many members of our community that have been targeted by either the Russian community or the Russian consulate here in, sorry, not here, I'm from Sydney, but in Sydney there are many examples. The things that I would like to draw your attention to, which you're probably aware of, is Semyon Boykov and the following that he has, both through his YouTube channel that has recently been closed, but other social media, including Facebook, Instagram, Telegram. On Telegram, there's also a Telegram channel called Tasmanian Diablo, and that channel actively targets members of our community, starting with the co-chair of the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organisations that I share my role with, Stefan Romanyev, targeting our ambassador, Ukrainian ambassador to Australia, targeting honorary consul, community leaders that lead rallies, for example, in Sydney and other cities around the country, and making false remarks about them, spinning neo-Nazi narratives, trying to flip the situation, saying that it's Ukraine that's in the wrong, that Ukrainians are warmongers, that what we're doing is basically what Russia is doing to Ukraine, but trying to spin that. And they've found a very innovative and interesting way to do that, where they target different subgroups in Australia to try and influence opinion and perception. For example, through Semyon Boykov and the Russian consulate and Russian agents here in Australia, they have been very successful in infiltrating the anti-vax movement. Yeah. So first they become, they learn about the ideals and aims of a certain movement, they share those ideals and views, quickly become leaders of that, and then through that they place typical Russian narratives and propaganda, and they have been very successful in infiltrating that entire anti-vax movement here in Australia. That's just as one example. Yeah,
that's a really interesting insight, and I guess one of the challenges we have as a parliamentary committee, but that also the Ukrainian Australian community has, is differentiating between people who are just sympathisers for Russia, which, although we might find that hard to understand and frankly pretty offensive, it's not necessarily unlawful and not necessarily foreign interference, and those who are either directed or aided or encouraged by the Russian state, which obviously crosses that important legal line and does constitute foreign interference and a potential crime. Some of those quite obvious. The gentleman you referred to, I think, is currently resident at the Russian consulate in Sydney. It's fairly clear what his links to the Russian government are, but not all of them will be equally evident. How is your community dealing with that distinction between people who might just be enthusiasts and an annoyance, and those who are really threatening because they're representing the Russian state?
It's very concerning for us because it's difficult to draw a clear line. So we do see things that are completely just focused on the anti-vax movement, and that's clear. But then when that narrative is spun, saying that, focusing on all these conspiracy theories, saying that it originated in biolabs, then all of a sudden these biolabs originated in Ukraine,
yep.
And trying to spin it that way, that's when it becomes dangerous, because then that entire movement thinks that Ukraine is to blame and that the Ukrainian community is to blame, and then actively targets our Ukrainian community, where we've had members of our community in South Australia, in Melbourne, in Sydney, targeted on the streets. For example, in Canberra, we have regular protests outside the embassy. So those people that protest there have been harassed and threatened and approached. So it's difficult initially to draw that line, but when we see those narratives spun in a different way, specifically against Ukraine, and then inciting violence, radicalizing people, once you lose that group of people, you're not going to get them back. They will be convinced and they will stay on that path. And that's where our concern is, because once they become aggressive and radicalized, and we've seen it in other countries, that's when it becomes dangerous and our community starts to live in fear.
And what have your experiences been in reporting these instances of harassment and intimidation to Australian law enforcement or intelligence agencies? What reception have you received when you've made those reports?
So we've tried to be very structured and systemized in the way that we approach it. Every time we've had a community member that was either harassed online, threatened, we've had many community members that received death threats through Telegram channels, through Facebook, Messenger, and other social media. We've reported that to police. I think we have over last time I checked, it was over 40 official complaints registered with the police with registered numbers. We continue to add to that list. The Australian law enforcement agencies have been very open and willing to listen, but I think there's an issue here where they can use the full force of the law and where they can just sympathize and say, we hear you, but there's really nothing that we can do. So, for example, when these so-called freedom rallies were launched all across Australia, it was very clear that it wasn't a freedom rally, it was a rally against providing aid to Ukraine. And although it was under the flag of come march with us because we're pro-neutrality and against war, all the signs that you could see in that rally, all the flags were Russian, people were wearing T-shirts with Z symbols on there. So it was, there were very clear motives and messages behind that. Zelensky's face was everywhere with his name. So it wasn't just pro-peace. It was specifically against Ukraine, and that's where we saw a lot of aggression, a lot of bikies, the Night Wolves, different groups that that took part in that. And I, as a mother with a young child, if I would be walking past that, I certainly would be fearful. So it was very clear in inciting violence, and one of the slogans that was used was, and I'll say it in Russian and translate it, it was "Работайте, братья," which means work brothers, and that line is used on the front lines in Ukraine, meaning kill more Ukrainians. I don't know if you saw over the past week, there was a very graphic video that went viral about a Ukrainian serviceman being beheaded, and in that video you could hear the person putting the orders through. He was using that line, "Работайте, братья," work brothers, to kill more Ukrainians. So when we draw those parallels about what's being done on the front lines, and I have 6 of my own family members currently right there, and hearing that on the streets of Sydney and on the streets of Melbourne and other capital cities across Australia, it's not okay. We've reported that to police, but they've said that within the confines of the law, there's not much that they can do. So this is where we would hope that you can hear our concerns on that point of view, and something can be discussed or done on that front.
Yes, and in relation to those rallies, I mean, I have not been briefed on them, so I'm not referring to kind of any intelligence here, but I would be very surprised if they were entirely organic and they weren't in some way aided or encouraged by the Russian state, and obviously that is a matter of great concern if that's the case. I know there are other senators who have questions. I'll offer the call first to the Deputy Chair, Senator Walsh, then I suspect Senator Van, who's joined us online, will also have questions. Senator Walsh.